Hey, welcome back to our study of the book of Hebrews. This week we're going to be in chapter 5. Um, so, chapter 5, once again, continues this line of thought that we see in chapter 4. A lot of these chapters tend to run together. It's a big argument that the author of Hebrews is making at the beginning here. So, chapter 4 showed us Christ's superiority as a high priest in terms of his sinlessness. So we've been talking all through Hebrews as to why Christ is the ultimate high priest, why he overshadows anyone who came before him, who especially this audience might have viewed as authoritative, might have viewed as one to be respected or looked up to. The author's trying to make the point that Christ is greater than that person. And now, chapter 5 focuses on this same thing, but his appointment as a high priest. An appointment that comes from God above, not an appointment from man, he was simply voted in by the people. It talks about how Christ was appointed as a high priest by God himself. And the author starts this chapter with the criteria of a high priest, right? The high priest is chosen by God and is appointed to act on behalf of man in relation to God. The author talks about how the high priest is to deal gently with people. And the high priest can do this because he is a man. He's human. He himself is human, so he can sympathize with human weaknesses. And Jesus fulfills this, except that he has no need to sacrifice for his own sins because he himself is sinless, as we kind of looked at last week. And then the author goes on to quote the Psalms to show that Jesus was appointed as high priest by God himself. And the author here mentions Melchizedek. He quotes this passage, says, "You are a priest forever by the order of Melchizedek." And we'll talk about Melchizedek a little more in chapter 7. The author actually goes back and addresses that again, so we won't dive deep into Melchizedek here, but do know the purpose of this is that essentially Melchizedek was called by God as a high priest. So the author is saying in the same way, Christ was called by God as the high priest forever. So, moving on from that, in 7 through 10, at the end of this first section, we get really what I think is an excellent overview of the humanity of Christ. So this verse helps support a theological idea that we often call the hypostatic union. And if you've never heard that term before, what that essentially means is that's the compatibility of Christ being both fully God and fully man. 100% God, 100% man. So this is a hard concept to grasp. It's kind of an illogical concept to grasp in any way. How can you be 100% of both things? That's 200%. That's not how that works. But all this means is that Jesus was at the same time fully human and fully God. So we saw his godness, his divinity affirmed in the previous chapter. The previous chapter affirmed that Christ is sinless, that he's the Son of God who passed through the heavens, is what the author says. And now this passage starts to look at his humanity and affirm his humanity. The previous verses talked about the necessity of his humanity, right? That he must be a high priest who is able to sympathize with us in our weakness. And this passage affirms his humanity where it says, he prayed as we ought to, with loud cries and tears. Verse 8 says, despite being the Son of God, he learned obedience through suffering, as we often do. So we see that the humanity of Jesus is completely necessary for him to be designated by God as the ultimate high priest who is able to atone for the sins of the world. Now, after this section, the entire tone of this letter kind of shifts. It takes a little bit of a turn. He just went over who Jesus is, why he is greater than anyone who came before him, and how he has been appointed a high priest forever, right? and then he shifts to kind of a strong warning. I'd even call it a rebuke. The tone of the letter kind of shifts. Christ's priesthood is superior, but he turns to the audience here and says that your spiritual immaturity is keeping you from grasping this. He's explaining this hard concept of the priesthood of Jesus, but essentially is saying these are hard things, and you might not be grasping them because you are not spiritually mature. He basically says by this time in your walk with Christ, you ought to be teachers of these things. You shouldn't need to be taught these basic things. You should be teaching them. And I think this gives us more insight into who the audience of this letter is. These are probably people who ought to know everything. We know that they're Christians. We know that they have a Jewish background, but kind of given this rebuke, these are probably people who have been Christians for a good while. These aren't brand new believers. That's why the author is kind of rebuking them for still being spiritually immature when they ought to be teaching these things. And I think the challenge here for us, as you kind of read this passage, and even moving into chapter 6, is how many of us, how many of you have called yourself Christians for years and years, but still struggle to understand the basics of the faith? Now, this isn't meant to be a knock on a new Christian. The author even acknowledges that there's a time for milk and there's a time for solid food. But I will say, if you can measure your relationship with Christ in years rather than months or weeks, and you can't share the gospel on the spot, you couldn't explain what I just explained, why it's important that Jesus is fully God and fully man, I think this rebuke is for you. This rebuke continues into the next chapter, as I said, but for now, I would challenge you. Are you content with living on milk, or are you aiming to move on to solid food? Are you finding yourself not really asking the harder questions that come with believing in Jesus? Or are you just kind of content with, well, yeah, I'm saved from my sins. That's really all I need to know. Because I will say, this isn't for the sake of bloating ourselves up with good theological knowledge. This is for the sake of building a solid foundation in who Jesus is and why he had to die for sin. Because trials are coming. We know that as Christians. We know that life isn't always going to be easy. We know that there are hard times coming, especially for those who claim Christ as Lord. So the purpose of all of this, the purpose in building this robust theological foundation, is so you will persevere. The previous warnings that we saw in Hebrews, I think, tie together with this. Persevering in your faith and feeding on solid food rather than milk are intertwined together. So I'd encourage you, as you kind of think through this, take it personally if you need to take it personally, and start to evaluate, are you living on milk? Have you been doing it for years, or are you moving on to solid food?